Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. Delighted to have back Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who heads Peril at American University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back, Jen.
You are coming out with this new book, Man Up, which will be available out in September, although you can pre-order now. Um, the subtitle is The New Misogyny and Rise of Violent Extremism. You begin by saying that you had hesitated for a long time to take up this subject. Why is that?
Well, I think in part I felt that I was being pigeonholed as one of the only senior women in the field at that time. Was often asked to comment about women's engagement in the far right, in particular, even though it wasn't what I worked on. And I interviewed men and boys my whole life, and I worked on issues of masculinity, of the role that manhood plays or projections of manhood related to nationalism. And so I would talk about those kinds of things, but I didn't feel like I was an expert in this area. And I felt that commenting on it would just kind of weaken the very good expertise that was out there.
And what changed for you? Why did you decide you had to take it up?
Well, I got annoyed basically, and it turns out that being annoyed is a really good reason to write a book. So I kept seeing these instances where misogyny were was playing a role in the mobilization of men to acts of mass violence or the radicalization trajectory. So what we find is that 60% of mass shooters in the US of targeted violence actors have a history of domestic and intimate partner violence. That's just the documented cases. And it doesn't even count things like stalking, harassment, sexual assault, rape threats, right? And once you get to that, those types of things, anti-LGBTQ comments, right? The gendered motivations that are misogynistic or hateful in nature toward women or people on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, that's almost everybody. I can't really think of anyone. So that started to really become very obvious. The manosphere, the new misogyny, the online rise of misogyny became very obvious. And then finally, the sort of tipping point for me was Gretchen Whitmer's kidnapping plot, and where a group of unlawful militia members had threatened to kidnap and had plotted to kidnap and execute her and live stream that execution. And the language they used was so misogynistic, the B word, tyrant B word, right? A bunch of just awful things. And in the trial, the prosecutors, or the defense attorneys rather, just, described that as blowing off steam or big talk. And I thought that level of dismissal, that type of thing, that sort of was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And I thought I have to sit down and write this book.
Why do you think this has become so acute? I ask you and your colleagues this all the time in other areas. Is it
Yeah.
because of social media? Is it because of other factors in society that are helping to radicalize young men? Where do you
Yeah.
put the emphasis here?
Well, there's a documented rise in online misogyny going back about 14 years. 2011 is when researchers start to see the uptick. So that does coincide with social media platforms becoming more accessible and prominent in people's lives. What I think you have to see is that there is also around that same time a very real crisis in boys and men's lives that's now being talked about in well documented ways, in part because we saw the effects of that in the election a little bit more with young men, kind of being more attracted to rhetoric that is asserting a traditional sense of restorative power, coming back to old ways of being, a nostalgic era in which they were in control of everything. And but they do have three-quarters of the deaths of despair. There's a loneliness crisis, there's isolation, depression, right? So higher suicide rates. All of those things create vulnerabilities to influencers and propaganda online that scapegoats women, Jews, immigrants, others. And so that kind of feeds a cycle in which hostility is directed toward other people rather than toward structural solutions that might actually help.
It's interesting that you should say this because I don't think there is a woman journalist or a woman in public life who is active on social media who doesn't get a tremendous amount of this really violent misogyny. Is that because that's the most immediate factor that people recognize, oh, it's a woman? Or is there a specific tactical use of misogyny among extremist groups?
Yeah, so the tactical use, I mean, the way I define misogyny is the way Kate Mann, the philosopher, defines it, which is not hatred of women, but it's a law enforcement mechanism of the patriarchy. So this is policing of gendered norms and expectations, of trying to keep people in their place. And in that sense, misogyny and misogynistic tactics, slurs and abuse and belittling and deriding and talking over people, are all tactics that are used to try to keep women back in their place. So there's a chapter in the book where I actually analyze my own hate mail as the entry point to this, to understand. It's called containment, because once you strip away the actual sexualized slurs and kind of
Yeah.
grossness that comes, also false claims that I'm Jewish or trans, right? I mean, all these things that men often think must be true if I'm talking about these issues. So once you strip all of that away, almost all of the hate mail involves motion, meaning they want me to go somewhere, go back under the rock, stop being front and center, go back to Russia, get back in the shithole that you came out of, if I can say that. Whatever, like those types of things. It's constant. It's a constant thread. And once you see that, you understand, get back in the kitchen, get back in the closet, directed toward LGBTQ folks. Like, this idea that you can't be front and center, that it's taking some kind of power from me, is a really interesting form of kind of gender policing. And misogynistic tactics are meant to do that. They are a kind of a strategy to police people's behaviors and try to put them in their place.
Historians, sociologists who have looked at right-wing groups throughout history have noticed that there is a strong element in all of these movements. There is a strong element, for example, of rape among leaders who lead these right-wing movements. What is it about right-wing ideology and misogyny and the violence that ensues that go together?
Well, in particular, I think you see both in far right ideology and also to some extent in jihadist ideology. They're very similar in this sense of power, of supremacy being, so whether it's a civilizational supremacy, white supremacy, it intersects very easily with male supremacy. And so those two types of supremacist thinking, in which there's a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, in which one group is feels entitled to receive more power, and the labor of others, the domestic labor, the sexual labor, the attention and care from women, right? That some men feel entitled to in a male supremacist way of thinking. In a white supremacist way of thinking, you might feel entitled to that from people of color or from immigrants. And so those types of logics go very well together. They're very much intertwined. And in fact, in Perel's mapping of misogynistic narratives online, the most important intersection, meaning the most frequent intersection that's happening right now, is misogynistic narratives with anti-Semitic ones. So you get that intersection very deeply intertwined. And so misogynistic narratives, which are so accessible, can also introduce other forms of hate.
That's fascinating. There is also a development, at least in the current form of right-wing ideology, that goes by various names, eugenics, pronatalism, which is an effort to return women to a sole function of baby creation. And the rationale goes somewhat along the lines that we're being threatened, we're being overrun, we need more babies. Women who are working are part of this plot to undermine white civilization. Talk a little bit about how that jives with what you see online and what you see in the rise of violent ideology.
Yeah, one of the things we see in white supremacist terrorist attacks, for example, from Norway, that terrible attack in 2011, to Buffalo, to Pittsburgh, to El Paso, Christchurch, New Zealand, all of these places, and in Charleston, the terrorist actors, or the men who took out, who enacted that crime, these horrific levels of violence, were either in their manifestos, in what they said at the time, they referenced either minorities raping white women, or they referenced reproductive rights, that white women aren't producing enough babies, right? This is the great replacement conspiracy theory, is inherently anti-feminist, inherently also about women's rights, at the same time as it's anti-Semitic. And so you get those kinds of intersections of the control of women's reproductive power. I think the Minnesota shootings are a perfect
Yeah.
example of this, where this man who killed two elected officials in their homes, was described by the media as having attacked progressive politicians, which is true. But what the media really didn't talk about very much is that those progressive issues were gendered ones. This was about reproductive rights, it was about abortion, and it was about LGBTQ issues and trans identities, right? And so attacking allies of LGBTQ communities, of abortion rights, and having Planned Parenthood clinics on his target list was, an essential part of his motivation in ways that even the liberal media has silenced in many ways by looking past. And so, on the right wing side, you have this reinforcement of it, but we also have a lot of complacency within the rest of the coverage in terms of not really identifying gender as at the root of a lot of these issues.
One of the aspects of this that you've talked about is how this intersects with LGBTQ ideology and trans issues. And you see these sort of claims that are meant to rile up people, that your children are being groomed, your children's gender identity will be changed without your consent. How does that meld into this white domination and white supremacy issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of different ways it does. The groomer slur, which, by the way, we in the US have now exported to countries around the world. I mean, like we have exported QAnon. We're creating this stuff and sending it out around the world globally in really harmful ways too. But that slur and this idea that this false claim that LGBTQ communities are more likely to harm a child, which is not the data, not what the data shows. It's not who children are most at risk from being sexually abused by, right? So one, that is a false claim. And it also links to this obsessive, fixation that the far right has on child protection and child predators in QAnon, right? And so you end up getting this whole riled up obsession or false claim around groomers, around the LGBTQ community being a threat, an existential threat, which it goes back decades, right? That's very old claims that are false, and then using conspiracy theories like QAnon, and so you end up with this shooter showing up at Comet Pizza in Northwest DC, thinking he's going to rescue children from a child trafficking ring, right? So it all kind of feeds together this robust fear that circulates that children are being harmed, and then blaming it on, in many different ways, on the wrong people, until now we see finally, some more attention again to Epstein.
Absolutely. And of course, the sort of rhetoric and the conspiracy theories collapse on one another
Yeah,
because they kind of don't know what to do with the implication that
yeah,
right-wing politicians might be exposed by this. So,
exactly.
is there a way of, and this I know is something that Peril focuses on,
Yeah.
of intervening to disentangle all of this, to help young men and boys avoid being sucked into this kind of
Yeah.
ideology?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the first things that's really important is just talking with boys and men about how algorithms work and how they deliver manosphere and harmful male supremacist content to them right now in under 4 minutes for a 16-year-old boy's sock puppet account, right? So researchers have found just by searching on a new account that they set up for things like fitness or sports, so that codes them as boys, within 4 minutes they get that content, and if they hover over the videos even for a short time, the way the algorithms prioritize engagement, pretty soon they get the majority of their feed is set up that way, and so that can really skew the way that kids think. So when I'm out in high schools, like I am a lot of the time, that's the first thing we talk about is, do kids understand how gendered content comes their way? Girls get pro anorexia content, they get self-harm content, they get all kinds of content that fixates on appearance, on cosmetic enhancements. Boys get the same type of thing with looks maxing content that is telling them they should get, jaw surgery or shin lengthening surgery, or, obsessively fixate about their bodies in order to be attractive to women. And so, they get that content very quickly and don't realize how it's shaping them. So one thing is having open conversations about what their online lives are, what does it mean to grapple with how much violence crosses their feeds, including violent pornography that is ever more violent than previous generations. And then secondly, having conversations with mentors about what alternatives and healthier forms of masculinities might look like. And so there are groups like the Good Men Project, Walking Talking Men. There's a lot of different NGOs now within the men's wellness world that see this, approach it from a sort of strengths-based perspective that says it's not, we don't have to just say this is you're bad as men, but there are ways that we can talk about opening yourselves up to the fuller range of human capacity, embracing caregiving and emotional responses, and not just feeling like you have to be dominant and aggressive and stoic in the face of whatever you're confronting, and that also might help some of the vulnerabilities around the loneliness side of things.
There's always a question as to whether politicians are leading the conversation or simply reflecting back what they hear because they want to endear themselves to the public. What happens when you have people in positions of authority who speak in violent, destructive, openly misogynistic terms, or who seek to remove women from positions of power, whether it's in the military or elsewhere? What does that do? And does that make the problem worse, or is that simply reflecting what is going out there in the culture?
It absolutely makes the problem worse. I mean, this is one of the problems with what we call, legitimation and normalization happening. So there's this cycle, right? It's not that it only comes from the fringes into the mainstream. The mainstream also helps validate and legitimize what's happening in the fringes. And so once you see this normalization of rhetoric by appointing to leadership positions, people who have credibly been accused or settled lawsuits for sexual assault. When you have elected officials who have credibly been accused or settled lawsuits for sexual assault or been found guilty, I mean, those situations make it seem much more normal. Or that when you have boys calling for things like repeal the 19th, but you can hear on a mainstream media platform things like one household, one vote, right? Those types of things, you get this echo effect that normalizes, that legitimizes, that makes it seem less shocking than it was before.
And this is not just a problem in the United States.
Right.
As some of the incidents that you cited are Norway and New Zealand, it's really a global phenomenon. How much now is the influence, the reinforcement international in nature as
Yeah.
opposed to just what's going on in the United States?
Well, it's a really interesting question because one of the things I hope this book does, and I'm, briefing some folks at the UN about it in the fall, is that the UN starts to take a more serious effort to look at things like domestic violent extremism, which until now, really, the UN has largely seen as the domestic problems of member states. So, unless there's an international tie, they haven't really been able to get involved, but they do have a mandate to combat gender based violence. And so, when you can see the connections between gender based violence, between sex trafficking and prostitution rings, one run by white supremacist groups, for example, as we have here in this country and abroad, then the UN can start to see that these are problems on the financing, on the ideology side that they could get involved with. And one of the things that I think the UN has been very good at is drawing attention to these same abuses that happen in Islamist groups, right? When you're talking about the Nigerian schoolgirls or the Yazidi women, or how Al-Shabaab has abused children, or the sexual violence of Hamas, even though there was a lot of blowback with people not believing that and thinking it was a conspiracy, there still are like a dozen reports out from the UN on those atrocities. But there's silence when it comes to white supremacist groups or far right groups or militia groups doing the same kinds of things, even though we know it happens. And so, just one example is you'll see things like neo-Nazi groups being arrested, broken up rings being arrested on drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, or racketeering charges. The DEA itself says drug trafficking goes hand in hand with sex trafficking. Where there's one, there's the other. They're almost indistinguishable. And so you'll see media coverage that says something like, 63 neo-Nazis were arrested in this raid, and the hostage negotiation team was on hand to assist. well, who do you think the hostages were, right? Like maybe we could actually bring some of this invisible stuff to light and start thinking about how do you get justice for victims who have been exploited at the hands of extremist groups in this country too.
So, what's the biggest challenge that you're facing in terms of the media coverage? We talked about that. Is it ignorance? Is it kind of what I'll call the ick factor that people don't want to kind of go there? Um, what's the
Yeah.
biggest challenge you're finding in how this is covered?
I, I think that people don't see it, and I count myself in it. I think for decades I worked on men and boys and why are men and boys violent without really looking at the issue of misogyny or of male supremacist thinking in the same way that I'm doing in this book. And I think that it's easy to look past it. It's easy to look at other explanations for ideology and to not see how all these things on the ordinary level, domestic and intimate partner violence, rape. I mean, my book launch here at Politics and Prose is a fundraiser for the DC Rape Crisis Center. And I did that deliberately because I want people to see that these daily kinds of violent interactions that local law enforcement covers are connected to the national security issues that are covered by different agencies. And so we have these divides sometimes, what local law enforcement does, what the Department of Justice does, what the Department of Homeland Security does, that don't allow those conversations to happen. And sometimes I think that the media doesn't see it, but scholars don't see it either. And we've been sitting in our own little silos. So I think some of what I hope to do in this book is stitch it together, but also help audiences see that there are things that you can do on a neighborhood level, on a citywide and on a community level to combat gender-based violence that also reduces the likelihood of escalation to mass violence down the road.
It is a fascinating topic, an incredibly timely topic. I'll hold it up again. Man Up, fascinating reading. And I think the most important work that you do there is that there is a way of intervening. We don't have to be
Absolutely.
passive. We don't have to be observers in our own cultural destruction. And
That's
so
right.
thank you for that. We'll look forward to it. I'm sure the book is going to be a bestseller and that
Thanks, Jen.
hopefully get a lot of conversations going that should have started a while ago. So thanks so much. It's great to see you again,
Thank
Cynthia.
you,
We'll have
Jen.
you
Good to
back
see you
soon.
too. All
Bye
right. Be
bye.
well.